text message lit up the conference room screen by mistake. 3 words. I miss you. The room went dead quiet. The hum of the projector sounded suddenly loud, almost accusatory. A few people shifted in their chairs. Someone cleared their throat. Across the long glass table, the woman at the head didn't blink. David Harper stood frozen near the door, one hand still gripping his phone like it had just betrayed him. This was not how a Monday morning was supposed to begin. An hour earlier, David had been invisible, just another grey-haired contractor in a wrinkled jacket, hired for experience, tolerated for convenience. Now every eye in the room was on him. Not curious, not kind, assessing, measuring, judging. Susan Mitchell slowly lifted her gaze from the screen. Her expression didn't change, but the air did. David felt it in his chest, that tight, sinking pressure he had learned to recognize since his wife died. The feeling that something was about to break, and there would be no fixing it afterward. No one laughed. That was worse. Susan reached for the remote and turned off the projector. The screen went black. The words disappeared, but their echo did not. "Let's take 5, she said calmly. Her voice was level, controlled, too controlled. Chairs scraped back. People stood. Murmurs started immediately sharp and low, like knives rubbing together. David did not move. His phone vibrated in his hand, a notification he could not bring himself to read. Susan stood last. She adjusted her blazer, straightened a single paper on the table, and finally looked directly at him. "Mr. Harper," she said. "Stay." Everyone else filed out, some glancing back, some pretending not to. The glass door closed with a soft final click. David swallowed. His mouth was dry. He had sent that text at 6:30 that morning, half asleep, sitting at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and his daughter's science project spread out in front of him. He had meant to send it to a number that hadn't answered in 6 years. He hadn't realized the message was set to forward during the presentation sync. He hadn't even known that feature existed. Now it was too late. Susan walked around the table, slowly, heels quiet against the carpet. She stopped a few feet away from him, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Clean, subtle, expensive without trying. "You want to explain?" she asked. Her eyes were sharp but not cruel. That almost made it harder. David opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "It wasn't meant for you." She waited. "My wife," he said finally. "She passed away." Susan's gaze did not soften. "Not yet. I keep her number." He went on, words tumbling now. "I shouldn't, I know that. But sometimes I don't know. It helps." "I didn't realize you forwarded a personal message during a client review," Susan interrupted. "In front of my board." "I know." His shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry." Silence stretched between them, the kind that presses on the ears. Susan studied him. Not just his face, his hands, the way his shoulders curved inward like he was bracing for impact, the faint tremor he hadn't managed to hide. "You're not embarrassed," she said. "You're terrified." David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I'm a single father," he said quietly. "I can't afford to lose this contract," your daughter Susan said. "How old, 11? Susan nodded once. She turned away, walked back to her chair, and sat. Only then did she gesture for him to do the same. David hesitated, then sat across from her. Outside the glass walls, the office buzzed again. Phones rang, footsteps passed, life moved on. Inside, the air remained tight. "You know what they see when they look at you?" Susan asked, folding her hands. "They see a liability, a distraction, a man past his prime who brings his personal life into professional spaces. David flinched. She wasn't wrong. And you let them, she continued. You stand there and apologize like you're asking permission to exist. Something stirred in his chest. Not anger. Something older. Heavier. I don't want permission, he said. I just want to do my job. Susan leaned back slightly. Then you need to understand where you actually stand. She tapped a button on the tablet in front of her. The screen lit up again. Charts, names, numbers spelled out in careful corporate fonts. Do you know why you were hired? She asked. For my experience, David said. 30 years in systems design. That's what they tell you. She looked up. But that's not why I signed off. David frowned. Then why Susan held his gaze. Because you were one of 3 people in this state who knew how to dismantle a failing infrastructure quietly, legally, and without triggering regulatory audits. David's breath caught. That merger they're all excited about. She continued. It doesn't survive without you. Not legally, not ethically. He stared at her. The room felt suddenly smaller. They don't know that yet, Susan said. But they will. David shook his head slightly. I'm just a contractor. Susan smiled. It wasn't warm. David, she said. You are the fail-safe. The words landed heavier than any accusation could have. Outside the door opened. A man stepped in without knocking. Late 50s, perfect suit, board member confidence. His eyes flicked between them. We good? He asked Susan. People are asking questions. Susan didn't look at him. We are. The man glanced at David, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. Hope your personal situation is under control. David felt heat rise in his neck. Susan stood. Slowly. Deliberately. Mr. Caldwell, she said, finally turning. If you have concerns about Mr. Harper, you can bring them to me. In private. The smile vanished from the man's face. I was just being careless. Susan finished. Again. The room went quiet. Caldwell nodded stiffly and left. Susan turned back to David. Her voice dropped. Lower. Controlled. Dangerous. You sent a message by mistake, she said. It exposed more than you think. But it didn't weaken you. She stepped closer. Close enough that only he could hear. It told me exactly who you are. Her voice softened just slightly as she leaned in and whispered. And exactly why they underestimate you. David sat there long after she walked away, heart pounding, the echo of her words ringing in his ears. He had walked into that room, thinking he was about to lose everything. He didn't yet realize he was standing at the edge of something much larger. David didn't go home after the meeting. He sat in his car in the underground garage engine, off hands resting on the steering wheel, long after the fluorescent lights flickered on above him. The concrete smelled damp. Somewhere nearby, a car alarm chirped once and fell silent. His phone lay face down on the passenger seat, as if it might accuse him again if he looked. He replayed Susan's words over and over. You are the fail-safe. At 61, David had learned to distrust compliments, especially the kind that arrived wrapped in authority. Too often they came with a cost. Too often they were followed by a quiet request to clean up someone else's mess and disappear afterward. He finally started the car when his phone buzzed again. A text. Not Susan. Emily. Dad, are you coming home soon? He closed his eyes. The rising panic in his chest softened into something heavier, steadier. Responsibility. The kind that did not ask permission. On the drive back to the small colonial house he had lived in for almost 20 years, David noticed things he usually ignored. A closed diner with chairs stacked upside down. A handwritten sign taped to a church bulletin board asking for donations for heating assistance. A man standing too long at a bus stop with no bus coming. The world was full of people holding things together, quietly, hoping no one noticed how close they were to dropping everything. At home, Emily sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by coloured foam planets and a half-finished model of the solar system. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. There was dried glue on her fingers. "You're late," she said, without looking up. "I know," David replied, hanging his jacket on the chair. "I'm sorry." She glanced at him, then really looked, her brow creased. Did something bad happen? David hesitated. He had learned over the years that children could smell dishonesty faster than adults. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "I made a mistake at work," he said carefully. "It didn't hurt anyone. But it was loud." Emily considered that, like when I answered a question wrong in front of the whole class. "Like that," he said. "Only with more people and worse lighting." She gave a small smile, then went back to painting Saturn's rings. "Did you fix it?" "Not yet." "You always fix things," she said, casual absolute. David swallowed. That night, after Emily went to bed, he opened his laptop. Not to work. To read. He pulled up the documents Susan had quietly unlocked for him earlier that afternoon. Internal memos, compliance timelines, a proposed acquisition that looked clean on the surface and rotten underneath. He saw it immediately the way he always did. A rushed consolidation. A loophole buried under optimistic projections. A risk that would not surface until years later, when the people responsible would already be gone. Susan knew. Or suspected. That was why she needed him. The phone rang at 9:43 in the evening, a number he did not recognize. "David Harper," he answered. "Mr. Harper," a male voice said. Smooth, confident. "This is Alan Brooks." The name landed like a weight. Alan Brooks, senior partner. One of the architects of the deal. "I was hoping we could talk," Brooks continued. "Privately." David leaned back in his chair. The room was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked on the wall. "I don't see what there is to discuss," David said. Brooks chuckled softly. "You will." They met the next morning at a cafe across from the courthouse. Old brick building. Dark wood tables. The kind of place lawyers liked because it made them feel serious. Brooks arrived early, already seated jacket draped over the back of his chair. He stood when David approached, extending a hand that was firm without warmth. "I admire your work," Brooks said as they sat. "Your reputation, I mean. Quiet. Effective. I'm not sure why you're telling me this," David replied. Brooks smiled. "Because I think you're about to misunderstand your position." David stirred his coffee slowly. The spoon clinked against the ceramic. "You're a contractor," Brooks went on. "Temporary. Useful, yes, but replaceable. Susan Mitchell is many things, but sentimental isn't one of them." David looked up. "You didn't come here to warn me." "No," Brooks admitted. "I came to offer you something." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were numbers written out carefully. Consulting extensions, retainer guarantees. More money than David had made in the past 5 years combined. In exchange, David asked. Brooks leaned forward slightly. "You finish your review. You flag what you need to flag. But you don't escalate. You don't make noise. You let the board handle the rest." David closed the folder. "My daughter," he said suddenly. Brooks blinked. "I'm sorry she's 11, David continued. "She asks a lot of questions, hard ones. About fairness, about rules." Brooks shifted in his seat. "I can't teach her that rules matter. David said if I spend my days finding ways around them. Brooks's smile thinned. This is how the world works. David stood. Then the world is overdue for repairs. He left the cafe without waiting for a response. Susan did not call him that day, or the next. The silence was deliberate, pressure without fingerprints. David continued his analysis anyway, documenting everything saving copies in places he trusted. On the third day, Emily came home quiet. Too quiet. What happened? David asked as she dropped her backpack by the door. She shrugged. A boy at school said we don't belong in our house. He said only rich people should live here. David felt something cold move through him. What did you say? I didn't say anything, Emily replied. But I thought about Mom, and how she said, dignity isn't loud. David knelt in front of her. You belong wherever you stand, he said. Never forget that. That night, Susan finally called. Are you free tomorrow afternoon? She asked. Yes. Come to my office, she said, and bring everything. The next day, David walked into the boardroom again. This time he did not feel small. He felt prepared. Susan stood at the head of the table. Around her sat men who had smiled at him days earlier and dismissed him minutes later. Alan Brooks was there too, his expression unreadable. Susan nodded at David. Go ahead. David placed his folder on the table. He did not rush. He did not apologize. This deal he began is built on an assumption that will not survive regulatory review. When it collapses, it will not just cost money. It will cost trust. Murmurs rippled through the room. He spoke for 20 minutes, clear, precise, unavoidable. When he finished, Susan folded her hands. Thank you, she said. Then she looked at Brooks. We're done here. The room shifted. Power rearranged itself. David did not yet know what the fallout would be. He only knew that when Susan caught his eye, there was something there he had not seen before. Respect. And something else. The boardroom did not erupt. It never did. Power rarely raised its voice when it shifted. It moved quietly, like furniture rearranged overnight. By the time David stepped out of the building, the city looked the same, but something underneath it had cracked. Susan did not walk with him. She never did after meetings like that. Appearances mattered. Distance was a language the powerful spoke fluently. But as David waited for the elevator, his phone vibrated once, a single line from her. Stay available. He drove home with the radio off of mind, replaying every face around the table. Brooks' controlled stillness, the way one board member had stopped tapping his pen halfway through David's explanation. The silence after Susan said, We're done here. It had not been relief. It had been recognition. That evening, David cooked pasta, while Emily sat on the counter, swinging her legs. She talked about school, about a substitute teacher who smelled like peppermint, about a girl who cried during math because she couldn't remember her times tables. David nodded, smiled at the right moments, but part of him was still in that room, watching men realize they had underestimated the wrong person. Dad, Emily said suddenly. Are we in trouble? He paused, wooden spoon hovering over the pot. Why would you ask that? You've been quiet, she said. Quiet like when Mom was in the hospital. The memory hit hard. The beeping machines. The way silence had felt heavy, final. No, he said gently. We're not in trouble. Things are just changing. She studied him, searching his face for cracks. Good change or bad change, David considered it. Necessary change. She accepted that the way children sometimes do when answers sound firm enough. The next morning, his phone started ringing before 8. Unknown numbers, emails marked urgent, a voicemail from human resources that sounded rehearsed. David ignored them all. He drove Emily to school, watched her walk through the doors, then sat in the car for a moment longer than usual. Susan called at 10:15. "You should come in," I figured he said. This time security escorted him upstairs, past the boardroom, past offices he had never entered. Susan's floor smelled different. Less coffee, more polish. Her office was spare, large windows, a single framed photo on the desk turned face down. "They're scrambling," she said, without preamble. "Legal wants distance. Finance wants reassurance. Alan Brooks wants a conversation." David sat. "I'm guessing you're not offering him one?" "No," she said. "I'm offering him consequences." She slid a document across the desk. It was not a contract. It was an internal appointment memo. Senior Compliance Advisor. David stared at it. "That's a full-time role, with authority," Susan added, "and independence." He looked up. "Why me?" Susan leaned back, eyes on the window. "Because you didn't flinch. Because you said no when it cost you something. And because they won't see you coming again." A knock interrupted them. A woman in her early 40s stepped in, sharp haircut, legal posture. "We have a situation," she said. Susan nodded once. "Show him." The woman handed David a tablet, a news article draft, unpublished but complete. His name was there, framed carefully. "Contractor disrupts major merger. Sources anonymous. Tone suspicious. They're testing the water," the woman said. "Seeing if you'll fold." David handed the tablet back. "I won't." Susan watched him closely. "You understand what this means for your daughter?" He met her gaze. "I understand what it means if I don't." That afternoon, Emily came home with a letter folded carefully in her backpack. David found it while checking homework. "It's from school," she said quickly. "But it's not bad." The letter was polite. Concerned. A parent had raised questions about zoning, about eligibility, about whether David's contract work qualified their residence. David closed his eyes. "They're not allowed to do that," Emily said, voice tight. "Mrs. Alvarez said so. They're allowed to ask." David replied. "That's how pressure works." Emily crossed her arms. "It's not fair." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." That night, Susan sat alone in her apartment overlooking the river. The city lights reflected in the glass like distant stars. She held her phone but did not dial. There were lines she would not cross. Not yet. She thought of David's face when she had said authority, the mix of disbelief and resolve. She had seen that look before, years ago, in a mirror. Her husband's watch lay in a drawer she rarely opened. Tonight she did. She held it in her palm, feeling the weight of time, of choices deferred. The next morning the article went live. David read it in the school parking lot, engine idling. The language was careful, no lies, just implication, enough to make neighbors glance twice. By noon, a man from zoning showed up at his door, polite, apologetic, clipboard in hand. "I'm just doing my job," the man said. "I know," David replied. "So am I. The inspection found nothing. It never did." But the message was clear. Susan called him that evening. "They're escalating." "So are we," David said. A pause. Then quieter. "How's Emily?" "She's strong," he said. "Stronger than she should have to be." Susan exhaled slowly. "I'm coming by tomorrow." David stiffened. "That might not be wise." "I won't stay long," she said. "And I won't come as your boss." She arrived just before sunset. No entourage, no announcement. She stood on the porch, hands folded, waiting. When David opened the door, she saw the tension in his shoulders before he spoke. Emily appeared behind him, curious, guarded. "Hi," Susan said, lowering herself slightly to meet her eyes. "I'm Susan." Emily nodded. "Dad's boss." "Sometimes," Susan replied. "Today I'm just someone who wanted to check on you." Emily studied her, then stepped aside. "You can come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where David had sent the message that started everything. Susan noticed the solar system model still perched on the shelf, Saturn's rings, uneven but proud. Emily spoke first. "Are people being mean because of my dad?" Susan chose her words carefully. "Some people don't like it when rules are followed, especially when it costs them." Emily considered that. "That's dumb." Susan smiled faintly. "It is." David watched them, something tight loosening in his chest. Susan was careful. She did not promise safety. She did not soften the truth. She treated Emily like a person, not a shield. When Susan stood to leave, she paused at the door. David followed her out onto the porch. The evening air was cool. "They're going to push harder," she said. "At you. At me." David nodded. "Then we hold." Susan looked at him, really looked. "When this is over," she said, "you won't be invisible again." He met her gaze. "Neither will you." She stepped closer, lowered her voice. "Whatever happens next," she whispered, "you're not alone in it." The words settled between them, steady and real. Inside, Emily watched through the window arms wrapped around herself. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply nodded, as if she had just confirmed something she already knew. The pressure was rising. The lines were drawn. And somewhere beneath the noise, something irreversible had begun. The call came just after midnight, sharp and insistent, slicing through the quiet of the house. David woke instantly, heart already racing before he reached for the phone. Years of emergency nights had trained his body to respond before his mind caught up. "Mr. Harper," a woman's voice said, brisk, professional. "This is Officer Lane with County Child Services. We need to speak with you." David sat up, the room spinning slightly. "About what we received a report," she replied. "We're outside." He looked at the clock. 12:17 in the morning. He swung his legs out of bed, every joint protesting, and moved down the hall. Emily's door was open a crack. She was awake, sitting upright, eyes wide. "Dad," she whispered. "It's okay," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "Stay here." When he opened the front door, two figures stood on the porch. A uniformed officer and a woman holding a clipboard, her coat pulled tight against the cold. Their expressions were not hostile. That almost made it worse. "May we come in?" the woman asked. David stepped aside. The house felt suddenly exposed, every picture on the wall, a potential exhibit. Emily hovered at the end of the hallway, barefoot on the hardwood. "This won't take long," the woman said gently. "We're obligated to follow up. Follow up on what David asked." "A concern regarding stability," she replied. "Employment changes. Public attention." David let out a slow breath. "My daughter is safe. Fed. Loved. That hasn't changed." The officer nodded, slightly sympathetic. "We understand, sir. We just need to document." Emily stepped forward. "I'm fine," she said, voice trembling but steady. "I like my house. I like my dad." The woman crouched to Emily's level. "What's your name, Emily? And do you feel safe here?" Emily glanced at David, then back. "Yes." The questions were brief, routine, the clipboard filled with check marks, but the damage was done. When they left, the cold rushed in, and with it, a fury David had been holding at bay. "They used her," he said, quietly closing the door. They crossed a line. Emily sat at the table, hugging her knees. "Am I in trouble?" No, David said, immediately kneeling in front of her. You did everything right. But they came because of you, she said. Because of your work. David swallowed. Sometimes doing the right thing makes people angry. She nodded slowly. Mum said that. David closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. Go back to bed, he said. I'll be right here. He waited until her door closed, then picked up his phone. Susan answered on the second ring. They sent child services, David said. No greeting. No preamble. There was a pause on the line. When Susan spoke, her voice was low, controlled, dangerous. I was afraid of that. They're trying to scare me, he continued, to make me back off. They won't succeed, Susan said. Not this way. They already have, David replied. They scared my daughter. Silence. Then I'm sorry. The words were rare from her. Heavy. I'm escalating, Susan said. Tonight. Whatever you do. David said, do it clean. I always do, she replied. By morning, the story had shifted. A new article surfaced, this one quieter, buried deeper. An anonymous complaint about misuse of authority. About retaliation. About a contractor turned whistleblower. The language was careful, but Susan recognized the fingerprints. She stood in her office jacket, draped over a chair phone, pressed to her ear. Prepare the release, she said. All of it. On the other end, legal hesitated. Susan, this will trigger. I know exactly what it will trigger, she interrupted. Do it. At 10:30, she called an emergency press briefing. Not flashy, no stage lights, just a podium in a plain conference room. When she stepped up, cameras clicked, questions already forming. I'm here to address concerns regarding our recent internal review, she said. Her voice carried without strain, and allegations of retaliation. She did not mention David by name at first. She spoke of process, of accountability, of ethics. Then she stopped. There is a tendency, she said, eyes steady on the room, to believe that power is loud, that it announces itself. In truth, the most dangerous misuse of power is quiet. Murmurs rippled. We conducted a review, Susan continued. We found evidence of coordinated efforts to discredit and intimidate an individual who raised legitimate concerns. That includes leveraging regulatory mechanisms unrelated to performance or safety. A reporter raised a hand. Are you referring to Mr. Harper? Susan nodded once. Yes. The room went still. Mr. Harper acted within the scope of his responsibilities, she said, and beyond that, he acted with integrity. By noon, Alan Brooks had resigned. The statement was brief. Health reasons, the usual fiction. David watched the coverage from his kitchen, Emily beside him, cereal forgotten. She read the captions slowly. That's you, she said. He nodded. They're saying nice things. Yes. She looked up at him. Does that mean it's over? David hesitated. It means it's different. That afternoon, a woman knocked on the door again. Not child services. A neighbor, Mrs. Callahan from down the street. She held a pie steam curling through the foil. I saw the news, she said, awkward. I thought, well, you shouldn't have to deal with it alone. David took the pie, surprised by the sudden weight of it. Thank you. More followed. A note in the mailbox. A wave from a man who had never looked at him twice before. Support arrived, not in grand gestures, but in small, steady acknowledgements. That evening Susan came by again. This time she did not stand on the porch. She stepped inside, removed her coat, and sat at the table. Emily eyed her. You made them stop, she said. Susan smiled faintly. We made them stop. Emily considered that. Good. Susan turned to David. They're backing off, she said. Not because they're sorry, because they're exposed. David nodded. And tomorrow Susan met his gaze. Tomorrow we rebuild. The house was quiet after she left. David sat alone at the table, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. He thought of his wife, of the nights he had felt invisible, of how close he had come to shrinking back into silence. His phone buzzed once more. A message from an unknown number. You should have stayed small. David deleted it without reply. Upstairs, Emily slept soundly. The house held. The walls did not close in, and for the first time since this began, David allowed himself to believe that the storm, while not over, no longer belonged to those who had started it. The backlash did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, scattered and sharp, like glass, hidden under calm water. David felt it first in the way conversation stopped when he entered a room, then in the emails that grew shorter, colder, stripped of pleasantries. He had expected relief after the press conference. What he got instead was exposure. Susan warned him. Visibility is not safety, she said on the phone one evening. It's a test. At work, the new title changed everything and nothing at the same time. Senior compliance advisor sounded powerful on paper. In practice, it meant people smiled while calculating how to bypass him. It meant meetings where his chair was placed just a little too far from the table. It meant silence when he spoke, followed by questions that tried to sound innocent. David answered every one of them calmly. He did not rush. He did not explain himself twice. At home, Emily felt the shift too. The school counselor asked to check in. A parent she barely knew volunteered aggressively for the next class fundraiser. Whispers moved through the hallways like drafts under closed doors. One afternoon, Emily came home angry, not scared. Angry. They think I don't hear them, she said, dropping her backpack by the door. They think because I'm a kid, I don't understand. David listened as she paced the living room, words spilling out. A classmate whose father worked in finance, a joke about lawsuits, a comment about that guy on the news. They said you're trouble, Emily said. I told them trouble isn't always bad. David smiled despite himself. What did they say to that? They didn't have anything, she replied. So they changed the subject. That night after Emily went to bed, David sat alone with a folder Susan had dropped off earlier. Not digital. Paper. Heavy. Deliberate. Inside were records he had not been meant to see. Not evidence of wrongdoing. Something more subtle. Patterns. Names that appeared together too often. Decisions made in private rooms and rubber stamped in public. Influence that did not announce itself. Susan called while he was still reading. Once you see it, she said quietly, you can't unsee it. You've known about this longer than I have, David replied. Yes, she said. And I waited too long to act. There was a pause. A rare one. My husband, Susan, continued, used to say, power doesn't rot people. It reveals them. I think he was right. David closed the folder. What do you want me to do? Tell me where it breaks, she said. Not loudly. Not yet. The next morning, David received an invitation. Private, off calendar. From a man he had never met, but whose name he recognized immediately. Thomas Riley, former regulator, now consultant. They met in a hotel lobby that smelled like polished stone and old money. Riley was already seated, newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee. He did not stand. You made some waves, Riley said without looking up. David sat across from him. I didn't intend to. No one ever does, Riley replied, finally meeting his eyes. Tell me something. Are you loyal? David considered the question. To what Riley smiled thinly. That's the wrong answer. David leaned back. Then ask the right question. Riley studied him for a long moment. Are you predictable? David shook his head. Not anymore. Riley laughed softly. That's a shame. They spoke for 30 minutes, about nothing and everything, about markets and memory, about how institutions protect themselves by sacrificing individuals quietly. Riley never threatened. He never needed to. When David stood to leave, Riley said, "People like you think exposure changes outcomes." David paused. "Doesn't it?" Riley folded his newspaper. "It changes timing, that's all." That evening, Susan hosted a small dinner. No board members, no executives, just 3 people she trusted, and David. The apartment was warm, understated. A space lived in, not displayed. They spoke freely there, about the pressure, about fear disguised as procedure, about the cost of staying. One of Susan's guests, a former judge with tired eyes, looked at David across the table. "You understand," he said, "that once you pull this thread, it doesn't stop at the people you don't like." David nodded. "I know." "And you're still here," the judge continued. David glanced at Susan, then back. "So are you." Susan watched him quietly as the evening wound down. When the others left, she poured 2 glasses of wine and handed him one. He did not drink it. "Emily. She said she's remarkable. She didn't choose any of this," David replied. "No," Susan said. "But she's shaping it anyway." They stood by the window, city lights spread out below them. The moment stretched unspoken. David, Susan said finally, "If this turns the way I think it might, you will be offered protection." He turned to her. "At what cost, distance?" she replied. "From me. From your life as it is now." David exhaled slowly. "I've lived with distance." Susan's gaze softened. "Not like this." At home later that night, David found Emily awake, sitting on her bed with a book she wasn't reading. "I heard the door," she said. He sat beside her. "Couldn't sleep." She shook her head. "Do you ever wish this hadn't happened?" David considered it carefully. "Sometimes I wish it had happened differently." She nodded. "Me too." She hesitated, then asked, "Are you going to stop?" David looked at his daughter. At the fear she tried to hide, at the pride she didn't know how to voice. "No," he said, "but I promise you something. What I won't disappear." Emily leaned against him, quiet and steady. Outside, somewhere across the city, phones buzzed, documents moved, plans adjusted. The pressure did not ease, it sharpened. David lay awake long after Emily fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Riley's words. Timing. He understood now. This was not about winning. It was about when the truth arrived, and who was standing when it did. His phone buzzed once, face down on the nightstand. A message from Susan. "They're setting a trap. Be careful," David typed back slowly. "I've been careful my whole life." He set the phone aside and closed his eyes. The calm he felt was not peace. It was resolve, and somewhere beneath it, a quiet certainty that the next move would not belong to the people who believed they still controlled the board. The trap revealed itself as an invitation disguised as a courtesy. David received it on a Tuesday morning, tucked between routine compliance updates and a calendar reminder for Emily's dentist appointment. An external review panel. Independent oversight. Voluntary participation requested. The language was polite, almost grateful, and every word carried the faint smell of insulation, the kind institutions used when they wanted to appear transparent without surrendering control. Susan called within minutes. "They're moving faster than I expected," she said. "This panel isn't independent." David was already reading the names. Former regulators, industry consultants, people who rotated between watchdog and contractor with ease. "They're trying to box me in," he said. "Put me on record. Limit my scope." "Yes," Susan replied, "and if you refuse, they'll frame it as obstruction." David closed the document. "Then I won't refuse." He arrived at the hearing room just after 9. No cameras, no press, a long table, water pitchers untouched. The panel members nodded as he entered, professional smiles fixed in place. One of them, a woman with silver hair and an immaculate suit, gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Harper," she began, "we appreciate your cooperation." David nodded. "Transparency matters." She smiled slightly, as if pleased he had used the word first. "We'd like you to walk us through your findings. In your own words." David did not rush. He spoke plainly. He described systems and safeguards, timelines and risks, never raising his voice. He noticed the way questions were phrased, how they curved away from certain conclusions and leaned toward others. He answered anyway, carefully, precisely, leaving no room for interpretation that wasn't earned. An hour in a man at the far end of the table leaned forward. "Would you agree," he asked, "that your actions created instability?" David met his gaze. "I would say they revealed it." A pause. Pens stopped moving. "And do you believe," the man continued, "that your personal circumstances influenced your judgment?" There it was. The pivot. David folded his hands. "My personal circumstances taught me the cost of ignoring warning signs," the silver-haired woman interjected smoothly. "We're not questioning your integrity, Mr. Harper." "No," David replied. "You're testing its usefulness." Silence followed, the kind that made people uncomfortable. When the session ended, David left without ceremony. In the hallway, a young aide avoided his eyes. Another whispered into a phone. The machine adjusted itself in real time. Outside, Susan waited. She had not attended. "That was deliberate. They pushed," she said as he joined her. "They always do," David replied. "I didn't give them what they wanted." "Good," Susan said. "Because what they want isn't the truth. It's containment." At home, Emily was sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by papers. College brochures. Not hers. Susan's forwarded by mistake, then left behind. Emily had found them earlier and spread them out with curiosity. "Why are there so many?" she asked. Susan paused. "Choices," she said. "When you're older," Emily picked one up, "do choices ever stop being scary?" Susan smiled faintly. "No, you just learn which fear matters." David watched the exchange quietly. He saw the way Emily listened, not like a child absorbing instruction, but like someone calibrating the world. That night the first leak appeared, a partial transcript, out of context, a headline that suggested conflict of interest. Social media did the rest, flattening nuance into outrage. Susan called again later than usual. "They're accelerating," she said. "We're past soft pressure now." David sat at the kitchen table, Emily's homework neatly stacked nearby. "Then it's time." For what Susan asked. "For daylight," he said. The next morning, David submitted a formal request. Not to the panel. To the Oversight Committee's Oversight Committee. A rarely used clause. Public disclosure of review parameters, timelines, funding sources. It was all there, buried, deep ignored, because no one expected a contractor to invoke it. By noon, phones rang again. Voices tightened. Meetings were called and cancelled in the same breath. Emily came home early that day. School had closed unexpectedly, a gas leak nearby. She dropped her bag and looked at David with a seriousness that startled him. "Are we safe?" she asked. He considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said. "But we're being watched," she nodded. "Good. I don't like it when people pretend not to see." That evening, Susan arrived unannounced, coat still on, eyes sharp. "They're furious," she said, and cornered. David poured her water. "That's when they make mistakes." She didn't sit. She paced once, then stopped in front of him. "There's something you need to know. If this goes public the way I think it will, my position won't survive intact." David studied her face. For the first time, he saw fatigue there, not weakness. "Where?" "You could step back," he said. "Let me take the hit." Susan shook her head. "No, I've stepped back my whole career. I won't do it now." A knock sounded at the door. Unexpected. David opened it to find Mrs. Alvarez, Emily's teacher, standing with a folder clutched to her chest. "I hope this isn't intrusive," she said. "I wanted you to have this before it circulates." Inside the folder was a letter, drafted, addressed to the school board, a request for review, allegations phrased carefully, the same language David had seen before. "They're preparing to widen the pressure," Mrs. Alvarez said quietly. "I don't agree with it." "Thank you," David replied. After she left, Susan looked at the letter, jaw tight. They're leveraging community institutions now. Emily stepped into the room, having listened from the hallway. "They won't win," she said, not bravely, but matter of fact. Susan looked at her. "Why do you think that?" "Because they were scared," Emily replied. "People don't push this hard, unless they are." David felt a surge of something close to pride, close to fear. "You shouldn't have to be this perceptive," he said softly. Emily shrugged. "I am." Late that night, Susan stood by the door again, preparing to leave. She hesitated, then turned back. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm making a statement. Not corporate. Personal." David raised an eyebrow. "You don't do personal." "I do now," Susan replied, "because silence has been protecting the wrong people." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Whatever happens after that, you need to be ready." David nodded. "I am." She paused, then reached out, placing a hand briefly on his arm. Not reassurance, solidarity. When she left, David locked the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly. The house was quiet. Emily slept upstairs, dreams uninterrupted for now. He checked his phone one last time. A new message from an unknown number. Final warning. David did not reply. He turned the phone off and set it on the counter. Tomorrow would bring consequences. He knew that. But for the first time, the fear that accompanied the knowledge did not control him. The board was shifting again. And this time, the pieces that mattered were no longer willing to be moved quietly. Susan did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, the city still and grey beyond the glass, reading the same 2 pages over and over until the words stopped blurring together. The statement lay in front of her, printed, unadorned, stripped of corporate language and legal insulation. No disclaimers, no softening phrases, just facts, names, timelines, and one choice she could not walk back once spoken aloud. At 6:30, she folded the pages, once slid them into her bag, and stood. The mirror by the door caught her reflection. No makeup, no armor. Just a woman who had spent decades learning how to survive rooms that were never built for her. Today she would stop surviving and start naming. David was already awake when Emily padded into the kitchen in her socks, rubbing her eyes. The house smelled like coffee and rain. A storm had rolled through some time before sunrise, leaving the air clean and sharp. "Is today the day?" Emily asked. David looked at her. "I think so." She nodded, accepting it like a fact of weather. "Do I still go to school?" "Yes," he said. "Normal days matter." She considered that, then reached for her cereal. "Okay." At 8:45, Susan stood at the podium again. Same room as before. This time the seats were full. Cameras lined the back wall. The low murmur of anticipation filled the space. The board members sat to one side, faces neutral, hands folded. Lawyers hovered near exits. Susan waited until the room settled. Then she began. For most of my career, she said, voice steady, I believed that institutions could be corrected quietly, that if you fixed enough pieces, the structure would hold. She paused. A flicker crossed a few faces. I was wrong. Pens stopped. Phones lowered. What I'm about to say will cost me professionally, she continued. I know that. I am not here to negotiate my future. A board member shifted in his seat. I am here because systems that punish truth while rewarding silence do not fail accidentally. They are designed that way. She spoke for 12 minutes. No notes, no hesitation. She named patterns, not people at first. Then she named people. Funding sources, pressure tactics, the misuse of oversight mechanisms. The moment she referenced child services, the room exhaled sharply. That action, Susan said, was not protective. It was punitive. A reporter raised a hand. Are you saying your organization sanctioned this? I am saying, Susan replied, that my organization failed to stop it. The room broke then. Questions flew. Accusations. Defenses. Susan did not raise her voice. She answered only what mattered. When it was over, she stepped down without waiting for applause. There was none. David watched the live feed from his office door, closed phone face down. He felt the weight of what she had done settle slowly like dust after a collapse. This was not bravery. This was surrender of a certain kind of safety. His phone buzzed. A text from Susan. It's done, he typed back. I know. At 10:30, Emily's school called again. Not a complaint, an update. The board had reviewed the draft letter. It would not be sent. Mrs. Alvarez's voice was tight with relief. We're standing by you, she said. David thanked her and hung up. He did not trust the quiet, but he welcomed it. By noon, the story was everywhere. Not the version the panels had prepared, not the one the consultants had rehearsed. This one was different, messier, harder to dismiss. Susan's resignation hit shortly after. She had submitted it before stepping to the podium. No negotiation, no exit package. David felt the loss hit harder than he expected. Not because of her title, because of what it represented. A line crossed with eyes open. That afternoon, 2 men waited outside David's house when he returned from picking Emily up early. Not officials, not reporters. Suits, but softer. Corporate without uniforms. We'd like a word, one said. David looked at Emily, then back at them. You can say it here. They exchanged a glance. We're authorized to offer you a settlement, the other said. Advisory role. Limited term. Generous compensation. David nodded. In exchange for what? For closure, the man replied. For everyone. Emily stepped forward. He's not for sale. The men froze, startled. David placed a hand on her shoulder. Thank you, he said, quietly. Then to the men. No. They left without argument. That worried him more than anger would have. That evening, Susan stood alone in her apartment, boxes half packed. Her phone buzzed constantly. Messages she did not read. Invitations she did not accept. She poured herself a glass of water and sat on the floor back against the couch. For the first time in years, the future was unstructured, terrifying, clean. Her phone buzzed again. David, you okay? She smiled faintly and typed back. I think I will be. At home, David tucked Emily into bed. She held his hand longer than usual. Are you scared? She asked. Yes, he said honestly. Me too, she replied. But I'm also proud. He kissed her forehead and turned off the light. Later, alone in the living room, David sat with the silence. The house felt steadier than it had in weeks. The walls no longer listened. His phone buzzed one last time. A news alert. Federal inquiry announced. Independent oversight confirmed. David closed his eyes. The story was no longer his to carry alone. Outside, the street was quiet. Lights glowed softly behind windows. Ordinary lives continued unaware of how close they had come to being collateral. Tomorrow would bring new consequences, new power struggles, new risks. But tonight, for the first time since the message that started everything, David allowed himself to sit without bracing for impact. The ground beneath him had shifted, yes, but it had not given way. And somewhere across the city, a woman who had chosen truth over tenure stood in the wreckage of her former life, unbowed, breathing freely at last. The cost had been high. So had the silence. Neither would be ignored again. The morning after the inquiry was announced, the city felt deceptively calm. David noticed it on the drive to school, how traffic lights changed on schedule, how a jogger waited patiently at a crosswalk, how the bakery on the corner opened its doors like it always had. The world had a way of pretending it wasn't watching, even when it was. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat, backpack hugged to her chest. "People keep staring," she said, without accusation. "They're curious," David replied. "Curiosity fades," she considered that. Sometimes. At the school entrance, Mrs. Alvarez met them with a nod that carried more weight than words. "We're good here," she said. "Go take care of what you need to." David watched Emily disappear into the building, then sat in the car a moment longer. His phone buzzed twice. Messages from numbers he did not recognize. He ignored them and drove on. Across town, Susan walked into a federal building that smelled of disinfectant and old paper. No entourage, no counsel at her side. She carried a slim folder and nothing else. The security guard checked her identification twice, then waved her through with a look that hovered between respect and curiosity. In a windowless room, 3 people waited. They did not offer coffee. They did not waste time. Ms. Mitchell, one of them, said, "We appreciate your cooperation." Susan sat spine-straight, hands folded. "I didn't come to cooperate," she replied. "I came to clarify. The questions were precise. Dates, communications, names spoken without ceremony." Susan answered steadily, correcting assumptions, refusing to speculate. When they asked about David, she paused. "He acted appropriately," she said. "Before I did." They noted that. By noon, David's inbox filled. Advocacy groups, journalists, think tanks, invitations framed as opportunities. He declined most with a single sentence. "Not now." At 1:15, a courier delivered a thick envelope to his door. No return address. Inside were copies of documents he recognized immediately. Earlier drafts, alternate memos, proof that the pressure campaign had begun months before his message ever surfaced. At the bottom of the stack, a handwritten note. "You were never the target. You were the trigger." David sat heavily at the kitchen table. The realization settled with a cold clarity. They hadn't been trying to silence him. They had been preparing to move, and he had forced their hand too early. The phone rang. An unfamiliar voice. Calm. Female. "Mr. Harper, this is Deputy Director Elaine Foster. I'd like to speak with you in person." About what David asked. "About what happens next," she replied. They met in a small office overlooking a parking lot. No flags, no grand seals, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a woman who looked tired in a way that suggested long memory. "You understand," Foster said, "that public narratives are useful, but incomplete. David nodded. I understand that timing matters. She smiled faintly. Good, because we need you to do something difficult. She slid a document across the desk. Temporary appointment, advisory capacity, authority limited on paper, broader in practice. I don't want a title, David said. You won't get one, Foster replied. You'll get access. He scanned the page. Why me? Because you're underestimated, she said. And because you didn't come looking for us. David closed the document. What's the cost, silence, she said. Selective silence. David leaned back. He thought of Emily, of Susan, of the men who had offered him closure for a price. I won't lie, he said. We're not asking you to, Foster replied. We're asking you to wait. He left without committing. That evening, Susan came by David's house for the first time, without urgency, pressing in ahead of her. She carried a small bag, overnight clothes, a pause at the door before she knocked. Emily opened it and smiled, tentative but real. Hi, Susan said. I brought dinner. They ate together, the conversation, careful at first, then easier. Emily asked Susan about the room with no windows. Susan answered honestly, without drama. Did they yell? Emily asked. No, Susan said. They listened. Is that worse? Emily asked. Susan considered. Sometimes. After dinner, Emily excused herself to finish homework. David and Susan stood at the sink, washing dishes in silence that felt earned. I'm sorry, Susan said finally, for how exposed you've been. David nodded. I'm grateful. For what? For not flinching, he said. She met his gaze. Neither did you. They sat on the porch, later the evening air, cooling cicadas starting up in the trees. The streetlights came on one by one. They'll try again, Susan said. In quieter ways. I know, David replied. And if you accept Foster's offer, Susan continued, you'd disappear in a different sense. David looked out at the darkening street. I've disappeared before. Susan turned to him. This time you'd be choosing it. He nodded. That's the difference. Inside, Emily watched from the window, not intruding, simply observing. She had learned the shape of important moments. The next morning, the trap snapped shut somewhere else. A prominent figure was indicted. Not for the pressure campaign, for something older, deeper. The headlines pivoted, attention scattered. David felt the shift like a tide pulling back, relief mixed with unease. This wasn't resolution, it was repositioning. He met Foster again that afternoon. This time he signed. I want conditions, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Such as no retaliation against my family, he replied, and no burying findings for convenience. Foster nodded. Agreed. As he left the building, David felt lighter and heavier all at once. He had stepped into a space without applause, without safety nets, a place where power moved sideways. Susan called as he reached the car. I heard. Then you know, he said. Yes, she replied. I also know you won't be thanked. He smiled. I'm not doing it for that. A pause. Come by later, she said. I want to show you something. At her apartment, Susan opened a drawer and took out a thin folder. Old letters. Her husband's handwriting. Notes about the meetings he'd attended years earlier. He saw this coming, she said quietly. And he stayed quiet. David read a line aloud. Silence feels safer, until it isn't. Susan closed the folder. I won't repeat his mistake. That night, as David tucked Emily in, she asked, Are you going away? No, he said. Not from you. She nodded, satisfied. Okay. When the house fell quiet, David sat at the table where the message had once glowed like a wound. The city outside hummed on. Somewhere gears turned. He didn't know how long the work would take, or what it would cost. But he knew the story had stopped being about exposure. It was about endurance, and that he could do. The work did not feel heroic. It felt methodical, quiet, relentless. David learned quickly that real power rarely announced itself anymore. It hid in scheduling delays, in footnotes, in committees that met just often enough to appear functional, and never often enough to change anything. His days began before sunrise, coffee at the same table, a glance at Emily's backpack by the door, a promise spoken and unspoken that he would be home. Then the drive into buildings, with no signs offices, without windows, conference rooms where names were replaced by titles and titles were replaced by silence. He listened more than he spoke. That was his advantage. People underestimated quiet men, especially older ones who did not posture. They assumed he was there to observe, not to connect dots they had spent decades keeping separate. Patterns emerged, not crimes in the cinematic sense, habits, shortcuts normalized into doctrine, a culture of plausible deniability so well rehearsed that no one remembered when it began. David documented everything. Not dramatically, precisely. He learned when to push and when to wait. Foster's warning echoed constantly. Selective silence. At home, Emily adapted in ways that both impressed and unsettled him. She stopped asking when things would go back to normal. She started asking better questions. Why do adults make rules they don't follow? She asked one night while drying dishes. Sometimes, David said carefully, rules are made by people who think they'll never need them. She frowned. That's stupid. Yes, he agreed. It is. Susan stayed close, though her life had fractured outward since her resignation. She consulted. She spoke quietly to people who needed reminding that conscience was not a liability. She never asked David for details, never pushed him to share what he could not. They met when they could. Late dinners, walks that circled the same block twice, conversations that carried weight without urgency. Something solid was forming between them, not out of crisis now, but choice. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the river, Susan broke a long silence. Do you ever wish you'd never sent that message? David watched the water move steadily past. I wish I'd been more careful, he said. I don't wish it hadn't happened. Susan nodded. Me neither. The backlash never fully disappeared. It shifted shape. Anonymous complaints faded, replaced by professional skepticism. Invitations stopped coming. Doors opened more slowly. But the pressure on Emily eased. The school quieted. The neighborhood settled back into polite distance. Then one afternoon the call came. Foster's voice was different this time, tighter. We're convening a closed session, she said. We need you there. The room was smaller than the others. No long table, no audience. Just 7 people seated in a loose circle. David recognized 2 of them immediately. Former decision-makers, untouchable for years. They did not speak at first. They waited, as if testing whether he would fill the silence. David did not. Finally, one of them cleared his throat. We have reviewed your findings. David nodded once. There are concerns, another said. About scope, about precedent. David met his gaze. Truth creates precedent, he said. Whether you acknowledge it or not, a murmur rippled. Not disagreement. Recognition. The first man leaned forward. What do you want, Mr. Harper? David didn't answer immediately. He thought of Emily's face when child services had stood on his porch, of Susan at the podium unarmored, of the note in the envelope. Trigger. I want the process to outlive me, he said. So this doesn't depend on who's brave enough next time. Silence again. Longer now. At last, Foster spoke. We can authorize structural changes, independent triggers, automatic review thresholds. David nodded. Then do it publicly. The room shifted. That was the risk. You're asking us to limit ourselves, someone said. Yes, David replied. That's the point. The vote was not unanimous. It never would be. But it was enough. When David left the building that evening, the sky was low and heavy with clouds. He felt no triumph. Just release. At home, Emily waited at the table, homework finished eyes searching his face. Well, she asked. He smiled faintly. They listened. She considered that. Did they understand, some of them, he said. That's how change starts. She nodded, satisfied. That night, Susan came over later than planned. She stood in the doorway rain on her coat, eyes bright. They did it, she said. They announced the reforms. David exhaled slowly. Good. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet was different now. Not tense. Complete. Susan reached out, took his hand. This part, she said softly. You don't have to carry alone anymore. He squeezed her fingers. I know. Weeks passed. The headlines moved on. The inquiry settled into implementation. David's role began to shrink by design. Access returned to anonymity. Exactly as planned. One afternoon, Foster called him into her office. She did not offer a seat this time. She stood, arms folded. You've done what we asked, she said. And more. David waited. We won't renew the appointment, she continued. It ends quietly, cleanly. David nodded. That was always the deal. She studied him. You're aware this closes certain doors permanently. Yes, he said. It opens others. She extended her hand. This time it was not symbolic. Thank you. He shook it, then left without ceremony. On the drive home, David stopped at a red light and realized his hands were no longer shaking. He hadn't noticed when that stopped. That evening they ate together. David, Emily, Susan. No agenda. No subtext. Just food, laughter, the comfort of shared space. After dinner, Emily looked at Susan. Are you staying? Susan glanced at David. He nodded. Yes, Susan said. Emily smiled wide and unguarded, then disappeared upstairs. Later, as the house settled, Susan leaned against David on the couch. You're different, she said. So are you, he replied. She smiled. Better. Yes, he said. Stronger. Outside the street was quiet. Somewhere far away, systems adjusted. Rules took root. David did not know what the future would look like. He did not need to. For the first time in a long while, the work had led somewhere that felt whole. The message that had started everything no longer haunted him. It had done its job, and the man who had once been underestimated, dismissed nearly broken, sat now in the steady afterlight of a life reclaimed knowing the most important truth of all. Power fades. What endures is what you choose to protect. The house settled into a quieter rhythm once the work ended. Not silence exactly, but the kind of steady background noise that meant nothing was about to break. David noticed it in small things. The way the mail arrived without his pulse jumping. The way the phone could ring, and he no longer reached for it with dread. The way evenings stretched instead of collapsing into vigilance. Emily changed too. The sharp edge of alertness softened. She laughed more easily. She stopped checking his face for answers before speaking her own mind. One afternoon, she came home with a permission slip for a field trip and slid it across the table without ceremony, as if the world were once again a place where plans could be made without contingency. Susan moved in gradually. No announcement, No declarations. A toothbrush appeared in the bathroom. A jacket stayed on the chair. A second mug became standard on the counter in the morning. It felt earned, not rushed, like two lives, adjusting their weight to each other, carefully, deliberately. They talked less about what had happened, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer defined the space they were building. When it did come up, it surfaced in reflective moments, never dramatic. "I still get angry," Susan admitted one night, as they sat on the porch, the air heavy with summer, at how close it came to costing everything. David nodded. Anger fades slower than fear. She smiled faintly. But it fades. Emily listened from the steps, pretending not to. She had become good at that, absorbing without interrupting. Later she asked David quietly, "Do people ever stop trying to control things?" "No," he said honestly. "But they get tired." That seemed to satisfy her. Months passed. The reforms David had helped put in place began to surface in public reports. Dry language, dense paragraphs, nothing cinematic. Exactly right. The kind of change that didn't ask for applause, and therefore lasted longer. David returned to consulting on his own terms. Smaller clients, clear boundaries, work that ended before dinner. He rediscovered the pleasure of competence without exposure, of being useful without being watched. Susan found her footing in a different way. She taught, mentored, sat on boards that didn't mistake silence for stability. People sought her out now, not for her title, but for her judgment. One afternoon, as autumn settled in, David stood in the backyard, watching Emily rake leaves into a pile too large for its purpose. She dove into it with abandon, laughing, then lay still, staring up at the sky. "Dad," she called. "Come look." He joined her hands in his pockets, eyes following hers. "It's quiet," she said. "Yes," he replied. "I like it," she added. So did he. On the anniversary of the message that had changed everything, David found himself alone at the kitchen table again. Same chair. Same light slanting through the window. The moment no longer carried weight. It felt like a marker, not a wound. Susan came up behind him, rested her hands on his shoulders. "Thinking, remembering," he said. She nodded. "That's different." That evening they cooked together. Nothing special. Pasta. Bread. The kind of meal that meant no one was trying to impress anyone else. Emily set the table with unnecessary care. After dinner, David cleared his throat. Not out of nerves. Out of intention. "I want to say something," he said. Susan looked at him attentive. Emily paused mid-bite. "I spent a long time believing that staying small was the same as staying safe," David continued. "I thought if I kept my head down, I could protect what mattered." Emily frowned slightly. "I learned," he said, "that what actually protects us is showing up when it counts. Not loudly, not perfectly, just honestly." Susan reached for his hand. Emily watched, eyes bright, thoughtful. Later, after Emily went to bed, Susan stood by the window, arms folded loosely. "You know," she said, "some people will always remember you for the disruption." David joined her. "That's fine. And some will forget entirely." He smiled. "That's better." She leaned into him, and the city beyond the glass hummed on, indifferent and alive. Life did not turn into a fairy tale. There were still difficult days, moments of doubt, occasional reminders of how fragile balance could be. But the fear no longer ran the house. It visited sometimes, then left when it wasn't fed. David understood now that power had never been the point. Neither had vindication. What mattered was the quiet space reclaimed afterward. The permission to live without flinching. Somewhere someone else would send a message they didn't mean to send. Someone else would be underestimated. Someone else would stand at the edge of a decision they never planned to make. David hoped, if nothing else, that the world they had nudged into place would make that moment less punishing. As the lights went out one by one in the house, the story settled where it belonged. Not in headlines, not in courtrooms, but in a family moving forward without apology. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like and subscribe for more stories about resilience, integrity, and quiet courage. And if it spoke to something personal, leave a comment with these 3 words: stay human always.